Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome back to the show, Jonny Enoch. Jonny is a clinical hypnotherapist, lecturer, and writer. He has been researching extraterrestrial phenomenon and esoteric subjects for over 20 years. After witnessing a series of unexplainable events while growing up, his search for answers led him on adventures all over the world. This includes interviewing ET contactees, whistleblowers, and UFO witnesses. Jonny, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me back on your show.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I've been excited about this one because you're one of those researchers that I can go in any direction, talk about pretty much any of the topics I cover. So I'm excited to get into this. And I wanted to start with these series of unexplainable events while you were growing up and, what led you to your path that you're on.
Well, thanks for asking, Chris. Growing up, I most certainly had some unexplainable events that led me on this journey where I am today, as I'm sure you can relate and all of your listeners or viewers can relate. We've all had those experiences that we can't quite put our finger on what they were. We've been thinking about someone and all of a sudden the phone rang and it was them, or we saw something in the sky, or somebody appeared in our life and vanished when we looked the other way. Well, when I was growing up around the house, around 7, 8 years old, I was having these experiences where I would be floating above my body, just kind of looking down at myself, Chris. And it was a very peaceful, serene experience, but it was, leaving me full of questions. And at other times I would find myself rushing up towards this hollow fractal, multicolored lights that were coming at me. And I would all of a sudden be out in the middle of space somewhere with this incredible, beautiful backdrop with these beautiful beings that were conversing with me. And this, filled me full of questions. But I grew up in this very religious house where we had an information embargo, so to speak. We weren't allowed to, really bring these sort of things up. And I was sitting at the dinner table. My mom, who was a very charismatic Christian, very wonderful person, though, she would do things like change the word helicopter to heavenicopter. And so what I like to tell people, when, other boys my age, they were hiding Playboys under their bed, I was hiding the New Age and esoteric books and crystals under my bed. If I wanted to see the Playboys, Chris, I had to go to their house. And so, we had all these strange experiences that were happening. And, that's just one of many of these kind of experiences that I was going through at the time. But, at other times, my sister at 12 years of age, she has this memory to this day that she can still recall, and it absolutely haunts her. And I often tell people about of this experience with her, because with her, she has no interest in the paranormal. She has no interest in the things that the forbidden knowledge listeners and viewers are interested in. She couldn't be caught dead, watching this podcast or listening to this show, right? So what she's more interested in, generally is, things like what the Kardashians are doing. But she has this memory that she can't shake, that when she was 12 years old, in her bedroom window, these gray extraterrestrials appeared. And they had the large teardrop eyes, the dolphin-like smooth gray hairless heads. And when they showed up, the first head comes through and it's peering directly at her, and another head comes from behind that one. And, these experiences that came out of that, they shook her. And my mom, to this day, she doesn't like talking about it too much, but she says both of you were complaining that you had these little gray men coming into your rooms. And she herself said there was strange activity in the backyard. So these kind of experiences kept happening. And of course, I really wanted to know. I had this forbidden knowledge in front of me that I needed to find out about. And I'm sure you can, relate to this kind of quest where you get this thirst for this thing. So then I started, saying, how can I go further into discovering more about these subjects? So I started, using different applications of developing, skills with clinical hypnotherapy, going further into the mind. And, you know, we all go through this point in our life where when we're on this quest where we want to find out those big questions. We want to find out the answers to them. Like, you know, where did we come from? What happens when we die? Are we alone in the universe? So I guess naturally that kind of progressed to me going all around the world and crawling on my hands and knees, you know, in these temples and looking at these reliefs and glyphs and putting it together. And, you know, one thing I can definitely say, you know, to anyone out there that's going through this and you're looking for these answers, it never ends. You know, the rabbit hole keeps getting deeper and weirder the further you go.
Definitely. I can agree with you 100%. And I was listening to you on Jimmy Church, I think it was last year, and you were talking about an experience, a rather amazing one that your son had. Would you mind sharing that here?
Yeah, no, that's a strange experience. That came out of the blue because, you know, I'm into investigating these things, and I talk to people who are contactees all the time. And my son, he's not really interested in these subjects too much. He's a spiritual person. He's open-minded because, you know, he's hung around with me a lot. You know, he's heard these subjects. But he was out with a friend of his, and actually there was a group of them that were hanging around Halloween of last year. And the one thing in Canada that we have different than the United States is that in the United States, on, you know, July 4th, that's your day when you guys are out there with fireworks. But in Canada, Halloween is our fireworks day. And so everybody goes out and they let off fireworks. So my son and his friends who were hanging out, they went up to a park that it's rather remarkable because they went up to this park and they were about to let off some fireworks, and they encountered some gray extraterrestrials, but they weren't completely like the smaller Zeta Reticula type of gray extraterrestrials. One of them was quite large. And I guess with this experience, to make a long story short, which is very, very strange about this encounter that they had, is that there were footprints in that area that were discovered in the trees in the area nearby. And the day before that, apparently there was another encounter in the same area. And just before my son had his experience, a friend of mine, Derek White Sky Cloud, who is a Métis elder, and he's a seer, he was trying to get a hold of me to actually tell me about this experience with these girls that were having an experience around the same park. So the whole thing was so strange that, you know, I go back to investigate this site. I go back with his friend, and, you know, it was very strange to hear them recall it. And they, you know, it gave you kind of like goosebumps just to talk about it with them. But it's strange because there are some other people I know in the area that went to go investigate that site because there was other sightings in that area around this particular spot in British Columbia, Canada. And so what happened after that is when this other fellow I know named Chad went up there, there was a neighbor in that particular area, and he came out at the same time when Chad was out there investigating this particular site, and he said that they saw a UFO come right over top of this particular place. And they themselves had experiences there that spooked them out. So I would say the whole thing just took me by surprise. And you never know how close, you know, we are to these sort of things. And, you know, oftentimes when people are ET contactees, it runs in the family.
Well, that's what I was just going to say, because I myself have never seen a UFO. I've never had any contact experiences that I remember or know of. And there seems like there's so many people that have these experiences more often. You said it may be like a bloodline type of situation.
Well, you know, I think it can happen to anybody. What tends to happen is that if there's someone of interest that they start working with over time, and I don't think that it means that, you know, anybody's singled out. I just think that if somebody happens to be picked, there might be sort of an experiment or monitoring that's done over time. I personally think it's an agreement on another level that we have. But, you know, if you do want to see a UFO, there's lots of great ways to do so. I think anybody can make contact, or they can see one if they really ask for it. Recently, I was out doing a tour for some conferences and some filming, and we were driving up over into Oregon. And when I was driving up over into Oregon, I stopped by in Washington State over to the ESETI Ranch, which is run by James Gillian. It was, I'm sure you've heard of, right?
I've had him on.
What's that?
I've had him on before.
Okay, perfect. You know, because I've been hearing about ESETI Ranch for years, and I've heard mixed reviews, to be honest with you. Some people say it's great, they love it, it's fantastic, they're all the way on board with it. And some people tell me, you know, they didn't experience what they thought they were going to experience, and they were very critical. But I came in there, you know, kind of skeptical in between. I said, I'm going to be open-minded, but, you know, I'm not going to expect a lot of results. So we arrived a little bit later in the evening. I'd say closer to the 11 o'clock mark, actually. And I called ahead to tell them I was running late. We pull into the driveway, and it's very dark out there. So if you go to stay out there, you know, there's these little bed and breakfasts, or you can stay on the property and camp. We pull into the driveway, and it opens up after we entered the code for the electric gate, and we park in a very dark area. We pull out these lawn chairs, and it's amazing because James Gillian came out at the same time, and I started talking to him out in the darkness. He just kind of emerges from the shadows, and I start talking to him about this whole incident. He was the whole incidents about what people are seeing out there, the UFOs and everything. And I say, I'm very interested, I'm open-minded, and I ask him some questions about how ESETI Ranch works. And he tells me, he goes, you know, some people think it's a portal, some people think that this is a, you know, a dimensional area is kind of thin. But he tells me that the mountain that's in front of there, Mount Adams, you know, kind of has a perhaps base inside of it that opens up, and these UFOs come out. So I say, okay, I'm going to go check this out. Everyone has their traditional Dr. Stephen Greer style green laser pointers, and they're out there trying to spot things. And after a couple minutes, I was absolutely amazed, Chris, what I saw. And I think a lot of people, if you go there, you'll experience something similar. I saw these orbs of light, first of all, coming out the middle of the mountain, which was really interesting. But then I saw these, what I can only describe as saucer-shaped lights that came out of the mountain to the right, and they start making these strange flight patterns and formations around each other, and then they just kind of hover there over each other. And then everybody said, oh, they're powering up, and then they lit up, and then just going right out of the sky. And it was incredible. Everybody was like, whoa, you know, it was amazing to see. That I would describe that as an incredible UFO sighting.
Yeah, I'd love to have an experience like that. And I hear if you just have a good pair of night vision goggles, you can see a lot of the stuff that's up there. But let's go back here. Let's go back and talk about some ancient history. Do you think that Atlantis was the first human or humanoid civilization, and how advanced were they? What kind of technologies? I'm sure it's different than the technologies we would have now.
That's a good question. And I think Atlantis brings up a lot for people when you say that, because, you know, we have different theories about where Atlantis is. And in order to figure out the answer to that question, we have to go back a little bit here. And we have to actually ask ourselves, where does the Atlantis story come from? So the Atlantis story, we have to go back to Plato, of course. And Plato, we would hear that he was discussing this in the Crimeas and the Timaeus. And the story was learned from his uncle Critias, that learned it from his great-great-great-grandfather Solon, who traveled to Egypt when it was called Sais, and he met with a high priest named Sanchis. And the story is very interesting because when Solon traveled over to Egypt, and remember, Atlantis is an Egyptian story. When he traveled over to Egypt, at the time, everybody knew there was a flood at some point on the earth that wiped out a great civilization. We know the Chinese had a flood story. The Hindu had a flood story. It was 12,000 years old at least. But Sanchi says over to Solon, he says, silly, silly Solon, you Greeks are like children to us. You think you have this flood story? Well, there's been many civilizations have been wiped off the face of the earth, you know, by fire, by all kinds of natural disasters. Atlantis was just the last one of them. And what we believe is that this story came from a temple called Nefru in Egypt. And of course, that was wiped out on the Nile. Interestingly enough, Chris, if you go to Egypt, and I want to urge everyone, come to Egypt with us. We're going to Egypt coming up at the next year in March, and I'll show you this story myself. If you go over to the temple of Edfu, and you look up on the walls of this incredible temple, you see the exact Atlantis story. We see that they were a great civilization, a seafaring people, but they were wiped out by a disaster. Now, the disaster that we see described there is this serpent coming out of the sky. Now, some might describe this as, they might say it's an asteroid. Maybe it's a solar flare, and maybe it's some kind of an eruption. I tend to think that it's actually electromagnetic energy. I think it's electricity. Anytime we see serpents in the mysteries, we see the serpentine mysteries, it's an electrical type of current. The ancients called it fohat. It's the same electricity that we see on the staff of Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus. It's the same energy that we see described with Nikola Tesla as he's talking about scalar energy, or the Germans talking about Vril energy. These are the geomagnetic energies of the earth, the ley lines. It's like kundalini through your body. There's energy in our universe. So I think they were very advanced, these people. Atlantis has been theorized by many people, and I'm sure you've come in contact with these theories of people that believe that either their central hub was in the middle of the Atlantic Ridge, with the Azore and Canary Islands being the mountain peaks. And this was a group that was sitting there, coming out of the Pleistocene period, the last ice age, into the Holocene. And this is a very good theory that this is an area when the Earth was going through changes, that this was happening. And some people now, they have all kinds of theories where they'll say, maybe Atlantis was on the Eye of Africa. That I'm sure you've seen that with the Mauritania theory that people have come out with. I think that's thinking too small, because what we have to realize is that Atlantis was a global dissemination of culture. We see that these people that were there, obviously the Egyptians are telling us, the Egyptians are saying, hey, this is where we come from. Well, then we look at things like pyramids. We look at all these obelisks and pyramids and incredible structures. Well, we have pyramids on both sides of the Atlantic. Look over in the Yucatan with Chichen Itza. Over in Teotihuacan, over in Guatemala with Tikal, we have 140 pyramids in the Azorian Islands, a great gigantic pyramid that's over in China. We have underground pyramid that people don't want to really talk about, but it's there over in Alaska. We have a pyramid in St. Louis. We can go on and on about the pyramids all over the world. So to answer your question, was Atlantis the first civilization? No. Were they, a natural unfoldment of, advanced civilizations on this earth? I believe that to be the case. They were very advanced, and they did have very advanced type of technology. I believe that what we see with these obelisks, which we can get into today, obelisks and pyramids, what you're looking at is a very advanced form of technology. They were experimenting with geomagnetic energies and gravity, and that's what went wrong in their experiments, and they essentially destroyed themselves.
Now, when you're talking about this technology, I hear plenty of theories that it was actually consciousness-based, that, it's all energetic frequencies, and we're using the powers of our consciousness to interact with this technology. Is this something that you've come across in your research?
Yes, I believe that's the case. I mean, if you go back to the story of Napoleon, when he reached Egypt, he did a lot of good for Egypt. He brought in with him, these savants, these psychics and artists, and he was able to reconstruct a lot of things when he went there. And of course, he helped himself to everything in the antiquities and brought it back to the Louvre over in Paris. But when we go into Egypt further, and we examined what happened to him, when he went into the Great Pyramid, he went up into the Great Pyramid by himself. And when he went there, he came out white as a ghost, Chris. And the reason he came out white as a ghost is because he saw his own Waterloo. He had an out-of-body experience. And this is nothing new, because when we go to visit the Great Pyramid with my friend Muhammad Ibrahim, who we do these tours with to Egypt, which are wonderful, people that come up into the King's Chamber, when we go up into there, they start having these out-of-body experiences. Their consciousness starts to shift, because these pyramids are acting in many different ways. Not only are they bringing forth this great electromagnetic energy, which they're working with, but I do believe that there is a consciousness transferring technology, and it goes even further than that. There's so much there. One thing I've discussed before, and I was lecturing on recently, is the Egyptians were also eating something called mufkuts. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't.
Well, I know that we only have so much time on the show today, so I'll try to keep this short. The Egyptians were eating a type of a white gold material. And this white gold material that they were eating, that we find in even the 5th dynasty pyramid texts, we find that they were eating, it was called mufkuts. To the Babylonians, they understood this. To the Persians, the Greeks, everybody knew about this. What they were doing, they were accessing a sort of a consciousness-based technology. And the idea is that when they ate this particular material, it had its protons, electrons, and neutrons arranged in a particular way that it sort of upgraded them and gave them certain capabilities, and even helped them with regeneration and immortality. And what they were able to do is access some of the energy that was coming into these monuments and sites to even go to other places. In that place that we call, where they were going, this world between worlds, we call it the Field of Mufkuts. Again, in the Babylonians, they called it the Plain of Sharon. And if you think about it, Chris, I'll give you a couple hints here. What is granite made out of? Do you know?
Well, I'm pretty sure it's a type of rock.
That would be a good guess. Well, we would, if we're looking at the constituents, silica. And that's where when we look further, we get silicone, like silicone microchips. So it's just like piezoelectrical energy. When you look at quartz, it's a great insulator. And so you have great amounts of energy coming through these particular places. So in these particular legends, we know that certain priests and kings were able to lie within these sarcophagi, as we call them, and I don't believe these were originally used as coffins. So when they went inside of them, energy would come through it, and there was a transference of not only consciousness but energy. So you might start asking yourself, why is there one of these boxes sitting up in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid? Why are they located in specific places? And if you start looking at areas like the Serapeum, which you find a whole bunch of these enormous boxes underground in these strange chambers, they're like regeneration chambers, they'll get you asking questions.
Well, now that we're speaking of the pyramids, one of the other big questions is, how are they built? How are these massive stones lifted? How were they transported? How were they cut? What are some of the theories on this?
Well, I would say that, nobody really knows for sure. Nobody knows for sure. We have some very good theories. Okay, so not even in Herodotus's time did he really know how they were built. But okay, so when you see the name pyramid, that's a name we get from the Greeks. It's the pyramid, the fire in the middle. This is the firestone. Now, remember I was telling you about this mufkuts, which is a type of a white gold that the Egyptians were consuming, the priests and the kings. Only at a specific time period, by the way, did they rediscover this. This particular material that they discovered, it would become lighter or heavier depending on how and what it's exposed to. So if you expose it to heat or geomagnetic sites or electromagnetic energy, which we know a lot of temples are built on these geomagnetic sites, it becomes lighter and can move easier. There's something in the Cairo Museum that you could look up that many people call the schist disc, and it looks kind of like a bull with a propeller-like object in there. And a popular theory is that, if we go back to what John Anthony West looked at with acoustic engineer Tom Danley, they looked at the fact that this could create these sort of anti-gravitational fields that these blocks could be lifted up and become weightless. And so we have those sorts of theories. Other theories people have put forth that they've said that perhaps these were built at times when the whole area was submerged in water, and they just kind of moved them around easier in that respect. I tend to think that it was done with a sort of sound and anti-gravitics and some other sort of more advanced ways of doing this. I think some of these other explanations are rather primitive, but I completely dismiss any notion that there was ropes and pulleys. I think that's nonsense. I also think it's totally nonsense that it was a pyramid, or it was a pyramidal tomb for Khufu. That's totally nonsense. Once you go inside of the Great Pyramid, you see that it's been perfectly cut. It's built like a Faraday cage, with its granite, limestone, and sandstone. And I think that's why guys like Chris Dunn have, put forth these incredible working hypotheses. Well, how it works like a power plant. It's an amazing, magnificent edifice. And by the way, Chris, there are no hieroglyphics in the pyramid. And that gets us asking more questions.
Yes, that's fascinating. Now, something else that is similar with all these cultures, these ancient cultures around the world, is they had regular contact with otherworldly entities and their gods. Now, why do you think at some point this ended, or did it just become a secret and just reserved for secret societies? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, we have to look at the notion that when we see like Isis, what do you see when you see Isis, who's also, by the way, Pisces, and is also the goddess on the side of your Starbucks cup. But when you see Isis, she has these wings, and the wings are telling us something. When you see that, it's not just from our angel iconography. The wings are telling us something, that they went somewhere. They were coming from above. And so we do have this idea. And also, we have other connections to, the places like over by Abu Sir and the land of Bu Wizard, that there are beings that were coming here from Sirius over in Egypt. And we have all sorts of connections in that respect in our Egyptian mythology. But there's a very interesting story that has come to my attention over the years, and it was told to me by a very good contact that is a very reliable contact, and I've confirmed this around with people in Egyptology and archaeology circles, but it's sort of a hushed-up story I can share with you. That if first of all, if I were to ask you, where do you think Joseph Stalin spent all his money, what would you say?
I would have no idea.
Well, the interesting thing about Joseph Stalin, and when we go back to the Soviets, he actually spent all his money in Egypt or on Egypt. And, the interesting part about that is that when we go back into the looking at Nikita Khrushchev and President Nasser back in '64, they built something called the Aswan High Dam. And at the time, it was called the Eighth Wonder of the World. And to this day, there's this incredible monument that's a Soviet partnership with Egypt. But if you thought the Soviets gave a damn, pardon the pun, if you thought they gave a damn about the Egyptians building the dam, you would be wrong, because here's the thing, is that they were there for the same reason that Napoleon went into these places, or Hitler went into these places. They were looking for lost high technology. And believe me, they found it. What I'm told is that they went down into a cave in that area. They went down into a cave system when they were digging, and they go down into this cave area. And as they get down in there, they found a very strange, you could say, remains of a 9-foot tall body. And in this 9-foot body, it had all these kind of strange apparatuses coming out of what looked like a breathing mask, and almost like a very futuristic kind of body armor, or almost like a breathing apparatus that was there. And when they went there, according to the intelligence briefings or the classified documents, it was labeled the visitor. So I know that there was other remains like that were found, I was told, and this was something that was very much off the radar. Now, there have been whispers of this on the internet over the years, and people have gotten little pieces of this story, but I've been told many times by people in the know that any pictures on the internet about this are completely fake. They're all doctored up. They're not legitimate pictures, but I have talked to some very serious people that said that this was something that was actually found that has left people totally, startled. But we have other clues that there have been strange, things in Egypt, like even in the Cairo Museum, we find these 15 to 20 foot sarcophagi, 15 to 20 foot coffins. It says enormous coffin, but there's no bodies to be found there. So, we do have an idea that there have been other interesting things going on in Egypt and other places that nobody wants to talk about.
Now, when you're talking about giant sarcophagi and giant beings, they have evidence that they've discovered giant bones all over the world. Do you think that we were once walked the earth with giants at certain times in our history?
I absolutely think that. I mean, look at Egypt. Look at Egyptian mythology. Who's one of the progenitor gods of Egypt? It's Osiris. And Osiris is what? He's a giant with an elongated head. We have, giants that we can connect over to the Chocolate Mountains, giants in Ecuador. Look at the giants that, we've found mentioned in our biblical texts. I very much believe that there was a very serious and effective cover-up that was done by the Smithsonian, allegedly connected over to the Grand Canyon. So the stories of giants is nothing new. In fact, I've talked to many indigenous elders and people that have told me that they have stories of giants, that they talk about regularly.
Now, I wanted to move on to what we were talking about earlier about Freemasonry. Now, we were talking a little bit about how it kind of gets a bad rap and it's misunderstood, especially in a lot of people in this community. They associate it, I guess, with the Illuminati, just more malevolent things that are happening because of secret societies. I'm sure there are certain factions that happen to be Freemasons that are in on some of the more terrible things that are happening around the world, but I happen to agree that Freemasons in general aren't evil, and they aren't the ones behind the things we should be watching. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, the thing is that with Masonry, it's a complicated subject, because I don't even believe that, when we look at what we call a Mason, that's actually a new term. What the Masons are is that they're really a very ancient group. These are very, very ancient teachings of the mysteries, and it goes back into what we call the artificers. And that's a fascinating subject about who the artificers were, because we know Constantine's father, he was one of the artificers. He belonged to the Collegium Artificam, the College of Artificers. And this is actually one of the real secrets, according to General Albert Pike and Manly P. Hall, about where we see York Rite Masonry being the inheritors of the Templars. The Templars encountered the Dionysian artificers and the Eleusinian mysteries. What are the artificers? An artificer is a builder. It's a mason. These are also our craftsmen. And so when we go back further than that, all the early Egyptian kings and priests, they were all the artificers as well. And so most certainly what we see from Masonry today is that Masonry is the true inheritor of the mysteries. It brought it forth. But Masonry is complicated because, again, there's different orders of Masonry and different types of Masonry. Masonry has a different role it's played in history. There's times when we can look at Masonry as having a great political effect when we go back into the French Revolution or the American Revolution. But then there was a type of a constitution passed in Masonry that came out after the 1700s that it became more apolitical, you could say. But again, there's Blue Lodge Masonry. People go back and they'll look at French Grand Orient Temple Masonry, who gifted America the Statue of Liberty, by the way. And you can see a plaque at the bottom looking at that as a gift to the first Masonic Republic, which was America. Or you could say, okay, there's Scottish Rite Masonry, there's Memphis Mizraim Masonry. So again, a lot of people lump in all these various Masonic conspiracies and stuff, and they'll go out there and they'll see something on the internet. But like you said, there's many really great Masons out there that are fascinated by these subjects, and they're really keen to finding out more about what's going on in the world. And I'm glad to hear that you have that view.
You briefly mentioned that America being the first Masonic republic. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and how basically a lot of the layout of Washington, D.C., how it's esoterically set up based on these ancient secret societies and Egyptian mythos and everything like that?
Of course. Well, first of all, America was thought up, I would say, in Egypt. It was, I believe the Egyptians they'd already reached America. Columbus wasn't the first one to discover America. There was people in the ancient world that already knew about it. And America came out of these great ideals. We know, for example, it gets its name, America, from Amaruca, land of the plumed serpent, named after the serpent god Amaru of Peru. And so when we see its founding, even the founding of it on July 4th, 1776, there's all kinds of secrets there. First of all, it was born under a Masonic constellation, America. The colors that you see from the Star-Spangled Banner, those are connected even to the colors of Atlantis, so Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, red, white, and blue. When you go further into it, it was no accident. And the language that you see in the Constitution, for example, not only is that inspired by the Renaissance period, but that's all Masonic language that you see all the way through and through. The founding fathers were Masons. I don't know if you've ever heard but there's a very famous story that comes out of the diaries of Thomas Jefferson about what happened at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Have you ever heard it?
No. What is that?
Okay, so if you go back to July 4th, 1776, and picture this. We're in the Philadelphia State House, okay? The doors are closed, and nobody is moving. Nobody is even, mumbling anything. They're all kind of just sitting there, sweating away. They're stressed out. They're worried because of the British, and they don't know what's going to happen. But there's something great that happened, because America was not an accident. It came from an incredible blueprint. So what happened is, according to Thomas Jefferson, in his diaries, a mysterious man came from behind closed doors. And as he approached them, he said to this room that, had the likes of Thomas Jefferson, you had John Adams, you had Hancock behind the desk with his pen in hand, just trembling. The man said to them, "Do not fear for your lives. Do not fear the redcoats," or the British. He said, "God meant for America to be free. Now sign that document." And as he said that, he startled Hancock so much that John Hancock moved his signature all over the place. And we're told, the reason his signature is so big is because King George was blind as a bat and couldn't see anything, so he had to make the signature big. But the other story we get is that he was startled. Now, many people have asked, who was this mysterious man? Was this mysterious man an angel? Was he the spirit guide of America? Was he El Morye? Or was he Saint Germain? Was he an extraterrestrial? Others say perhaps he was the member of one of these secret societies. I tend to think perhaps a little bit of all of the above, but there were great things that took place. And I would definitely say that when you go back into the likes of Sir Francis Bacon, when you go back into the likes of these great minds, and those out there, they all had a hand in it. And America was very much a Masonic Rosicrucian plot. And it came very close to not happening. And so that's why these secret societies played a great role, and they've always played a great role in seeding our religions and helping preserve certain kinds of knowledge that the unthinking masses wanted to destroy.
So what are your thoughts on basically where we turned out and where we're headed now as a country. I mean, there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of division going on. I don't trust any politician. I haven't trusted any president in a long time. I think there's a lot of hidden hand activities going on behind the scenes nowadays. What are your thoughts on what happened? And, is this what they've had planned all along?
Well, here's the old saying coming into play here, that how do you tell when a politician is lying? Their lips are moving. And so what you got to realize is that, America, it most certainly has been one of the greatest things we've ever seen happen in the world. I mean, it's a country that has given us so much freedom. So many great things have happened because of America. Look at the great minds that have come out of America. We've had the likes of your Walt Disneys, your Martin Luther Kings, your Bruce Lees, your Steve Jobs. You've had your iPhones, your blue jeans, your bubble gum, all those sorts of things that have come out of this incredible enterprise. But most certainly America has had her hardships that she's come through. And, most certainly look at the likes of Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. Look at these magnificent things that have shaped us and molded us. But I think we can see throughout history that there is more going on behind the scenes than we're willing to admit. And I think a lot of people have a different picture of how secret societies control the world. From another perspective, I want you to picture this. Picture that our world on the highest levels is working in unison. Okay? But picture the fact that there are certain folks in certain places that are watching what we're doing. And they're allowing us to kind of go through what we're doing. But at the same time, folks on both sides of the fence are allowed to put their horses in the race. They're not necessarily allowed to get involved and, take the other person's horse out of the race. But ultimately, there are great plans that are made, and it's up to us to follow through on those, and we are steering it with our consciousness as a whole. And there are other greater forces at work, these universal forces of causation. But you might say that nobody really has the full, authority to, take over those reins. And at the end of the day, it does come down to us. That's why we are influenced on many different levels. But I think it's incredible right now in this age that we're in, this information age, of what we're seeing unfolding right now in the media of things like corruption, or there's a lot of very good people, a lot of very good things happening. So that we're really seeing that come together. But Chris, I do want to emphasize this, that most certainly there is a lot of incredible knowledge, forbidden knowledge, mind you, like you call your show. There is a lot of incredible knowledge and things to be discovered about our universe and who we are that are going to keep unfolding to us. And there have been folks that have done us a great favor to preserve this knowledge at times. And so we didn't destroy it or destroy ourselves. And so I think those are the beautiful things that we can look forward to in the world.
That's very well said. Now, I'd like to talk about your hypnotherapy work. When it comes to that, what is some of the areas that you mainly focus on when it comes to this?
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, in the past, it's really changed. At one point, I was interested in what it could do for the power of the mind, and people stopping smoking and, getting over their vices. And at other times, it shifted over into doing these life between life regressions using the Dr. Michael Newton protocols, which are fascinating, taking people back into the memories of their soul before they got here, which we can all recall these fascinating ontological, recalls of different places that we've been in and where we came from. And then I was also doing a lot of work looking at people who are ET contactees. And at times, some of the sessions I've done on people who've been ET contactees have been played on screens at conferences. But I would say that the last few times I was doing hypnosis, and I don't do it that much these days because I'm so much busier in my other work and my research. But at the last few times I've done it, it is focused on working with remote viewing protocols. And what's really incredible, if you take somebody who already is psychically inclined or they're very good with remote viewing, that you put them under hypnosis and the remote viewing is cranked up through the roof, and their ability to project their mind into other places is on an incredible level when we bring them down into the the alpha or the theta state of brainwaves.
Now, when it comes to the regressions that you've done for ET contactees and abductees, what are some of the more recurring themes that you notice when working with them?
Well, I think it's really incredible that people will come to me and they'll have a memory that maybe they had missing time and they didn't know where they were. They said, all of a sudden I was in the middle of this situation. I woke up several hours later. Or I was walking that morning at 9 a.m. and then I woke up in my car later that evening at 5 p.m. I'm always amazed at when they start recalling what it's like being on the ship, or the first time that they've encountered these extraterrestrials, that they start describing to me that the exchange of communication is what amazes them, that it's very metamorphic and telepathic, that they're overwhelmed by being in the presence of these beings. Sometimes the beings are very loving and it's very benevolent. It's never that the beings are evil. It's just that maybe they're shocked at first. That's maybe why their memory is kind of blanked about it, because that they're just in psychic shock that they're looking at this enormous being that looks completely different than anything they've ever seen. And so that's part of the cool, that's one of the cool areas of doing this sort of work. You get to hear these stories, and oftentimes it's very emotional for people. They'll be sitting there in the chair and they will be crying. And one strange thing that happens sometimes, Chris, is that when they're sitting there in front of me, they're interacting with that being in real time, and that being sometimes can speak to me through them. Like it's almost like time space is broken. And so that kind of stuff is really neat. And I feel like I'm in a privileged position sometimes when I get to experience that.
I've heard a lot of abductees talk about hybrid programs, and taking the eggs or the sperm, doing fertilization experiments. Is this a theme that you come across quite often?
I would say, yeah, most of the time that's what's going on, especially with women. There's a lot of women that have had these experiences where, maybe they physically also being able to, experience something that was going on with their cycles, or, I've heard that people developing all sorts of issues with their ovaries. I've heard different theories with this, which is really fascinating. But that's the thing. I think that these extraterrestrials, when they encounter people, sometimes people are scared, and they'll, in the past, especially with some of these grays, the different types of grays out there, because they're not all the same grays, but people have talked about their experiences, and they've been in shock. But it's not that the grays were being cruel to them or anything. They were just more scientific about things. They didn't really have the same type of bedside manner. I will say this to you. I want to add this, that being in the presence of extraterrestrials will change you. It will change your circadian rhythms. It will change your field. Like everybody has kind of an energetic frequency or to them, and it will change that resonance about you. And there are ways for people who are other contactees, they'll be able to tell you apart. And there's other technological means that I believe our programs and governments have for being able to tell people that have been contactees. So I definitely think that the hybrid program is real. It is something that goes on. People have constant memories of it, and it's a fascinating subject of the human race being an experiment.
Do you think that some of these hybrids could possibly be walking amongst us?
Oh, 100%. 100%. ETs are walking amongst us. And, look at what Karen Hughes said not too long ago. She's a World Bank insider, and she came out. And when she was talking on Russia Today and all these different news programs, she was talking about that there's a second species working with humanity. And she very much alluded to the fact that they had elongated skulls. And we have all kinds of ETs. In fact, Cliff Stone had very famously said over at the Disclosure Project, which is really cool, what he said, and actually he never was supposed to say it. Dr. Greer didn't want him to come out and say it. That's a little inside story for you. He said there was 57 types of species he knew about before he got out of these programs that he was involved with. And he said some of them are like the Greys, but most of them look just like you and I, and they're walking amongst us. The only difference is they could walk into a room with you, and they could touch an object in a dark room, for example, and know what color it is without even looking at it. They might have a heightened sense of smell or a heightened sense of taste, but they're definitely here already.
That's amazing. Now, when we're talking about human consciousness abilities, ever since I was a kid, I've always thought there's got to be so much more to what I am, to the abilities that I have. I can just feel it. There's just so much more that is meant for the human race. And how far do you think our abilities can go as far as psychic abilities? I know that we can astral project. We have the ability to go to different dimensions and possibly different universes with our consciousness. What are the possibilities with this? And earlier we talked about using consciousness for technologies, for energy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you are a very incredible and complex vehicle, like a very complex computer. And we know that you've been engineered in a certain way, especially when we look at your DNA. Your DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. It works with RNA, ribonucleic acid. Right now you have 64 codons. And we're actually seeing those codons expanding. We're seeing quadruplex helixes now are like, that's kind of growing now of what's happening to our DNA. It's evolving. And I think that perhaps that could be attributed to various changes out in space of where we are in our spatial coordinates in the what's happening right now around the Earth with the shifts in our resonance fields and everything else. But essentially, your body is capable of so much more than what we've been told. And the ancients knew about that. And I believe that they knew how to tap into geomagnetic areas of the Earth that unlock these areas. They understood a type of technology, which I call ancient consciousness technologies. They understood how to use that for, let's say, stargates and portals and projections and tapping into consciousness. And you're absolutely right. We have seen things like astral projection. That has, was not only was astral projection something that has been used for a very long time, going back into our ancient religions and philosophies, but I'm sure you've heard of Robert Monroe and the Monroe Institute. A lot of people think, oh, that's just some nice metaphysical new age place where they're developing astral projection. Nonsense. The CIA was involved with that. We know that even going back into what DARPA's worked with, and SRI, Stanford Research Institute, and Dr. Hal Puthoff, and Ingo Swann, Uri Geller, Pat Price, all those guys, they were working with remote viewing and Scanate, or scanning coordinates, which became Project Stargate. All those sorts of projects that have been utilized. So we know that these things are real. We know that they're very much treated like a science in certain programs. And I think it's the natural unfolding of our evolution in the future for us to become more than what we've been told, because I think we've been very limited in our perspective. Let me put it this way for you. There's people on this planet that know what we're capable of. If you go to the Vatican, you're going to see the Fontana della Pigna, the fountain of the pine cone. And the pine cone, of course, we know, as I'm sure you're well aware of this by now, the pine cone represents the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is where your DMT, your dimethyltryptamine, which is the most powerful psychedelic known to man. It's flooded into your brain when you sleep or when you die. Dr. Rick Strassman calls it the spirit molecule. It's naturally created in our brains. But again, we have our serotonin, our melatonin there. Well, this has been called our spiritual doorway in the mysteries. Well, if you go to the Vatican, they have the Fontana della Pigna, the fountain of the pine cone, and behind that, we have an open Egyptian sarcophagi. that is telling us something. It's telling us that there we can transcend beyond the physical body. In front of it, in the Vatican courtyard there, you find an egg, which is not only like the Orphic egg that we find in the mysteries, but it also is the thalamus. And so this is very, very cleverly placed there. And they're telling us, that there are ways that we can understand that we can become more than human, so to speak.
When it comes to our consciousness and the afterlife or the spirit world, do you think that we are reincarnated?
Sometimes. Okay, so it's a choice for you to come here. We come here to grow and evolve. And it's not really a punishment or anything negative. You come here and you come here to learn. But there are other planets and places you can go, and you can choose to stay back on the spirit side if you wish. And that's interesting because I have a wonderful friend out here named Garnet Schulhauser. If you've never interviewed him, I strongly suggest you check him out. Check out his books. He was a lawyer of 30 years that didn't really believe in any of this stuff, and all of a sudden he encountered his spirit guide one day as a homeless man, and he was taken out on these out-of-body experiences out into an area that we would call, heaven or the spirit side, and got to encounter the universe in a very strange way. And he goes out into this place that we call heaven, which he says on the other side they call it Aglaya, which is very interesting. But in my experience, I've interviewed lots of people who have been near-death experience survivors, such as another dear friend of mine, Daniel Brinkley, who has a very famous NDE story where he was struck by lightning, was dead for 28 minutes. And I think everybody that you talk to that's an NDE or somebody who's been to that other side that can answer this question for you, they'll tell you that we all go through a set of steps when we die. We review our life on a 360-degree panoramic view. We see everything we've ever done. We become every person we've ever been with, and then we go before a council. We review our life, and over there, it's incredible. We have schools that we can go through. We have types of music. We reunite with our friends. We discuss things, and we say, do we want to review our life or other people's lives? So we want to hop in there of what we call the Akashic records. Do we want to see if there's anything else there we're checking out? And most of the time we make the decision ourselves, even though right now we might say this world is a huge pain in the ass, and I can't stand my job, and my don't like my neighbor, and all this sort of stuff. But we always choose to come here.
Very interesting. Now, there are some very interesting things going on right now with disclosure. I'm not sure if I trust the sources that it's coming from, but it is interesting. We've never seen buzz like this before around the UFO phenomenon. It's opening a lot of people's eyes to it, raising a lot of eyebrows. It's bringing some awareness no matter where it's coming from. What are your thoughts on this and where it possibly may be going?
Well, disclosure is coming from many different places, and I think that's great, because what you'll notice now, which is really fantastic, is you'll have somebody stepping out from every community with every type of disclosure. So we'll have a very military, scientific-oriented disclosure. We have disclosure that's coming out from more of the ancient side. I like to look at disclosure in every direction. So for me, it's, I like to relate it to consciousness, to physics, to the scientific, to our current day society. I like to look at it on every aspect. So I'm one of those people that is open-minded to seeing it in all the angles, but there are folks out there that are still stuck in a certain paradigm, and that's okay. Maybe they wish to see it from a more of a narrow religious perspective. So they'll say, okay, we're willing to accept that there is stuff going on and we're having interactions, but we don't want to call these beings extraterrestrials, and we don't want to admit that there's other life forms out in the universe. So maybe they'll say these are demons impersonating ETs. And they'll come at it from different angles. But, we can say perhaps that there's political agendas, and maybe people could use this, for their advantage. But at the end of the day, each and every single one of us, we have to evaluate whatever it is that we're reading or hearing, and we have to ask ourselves, how does it make us feel? Does it resonate with us? Does it match with our own personal truth? And we come to a point where we can decipher it that way. What do you feel, Chris? What do you feel about what's happening with disclosure?
I'm excited on one aspect from the disclosure that's coming from people like us, the independent researchers, the people that I speak with. It's really fascinating. It's really exciting. As far as the military disclosure, it's probably for a purpose. I couldn't tell you what it is, but nonetheless, it's still disclosure, like you said. And I'm excited about it. I'm ready for what happens next. Definitely.
Well, I'll tell you this: there are folks in the military realm, really good folks that I've talked to, that have told me in private conversations before, just personal opinions, even, that the weight that they have that's on their shoulders of just knowing about this really cool reality that this has been taking place, and the concern that they have, the deep concern that eventually the rest of humanity is going to have to come face to face with this reality. And I don't think it's a negative thing. I think it's a beautiful thing that we're not alone in the universe. And we've known for a long time. Okay, seriously. Galileo Galilei, he had his contemporary, who was Giordano Bruno. Bruno was telling people there was innumerable planets with other life forms out there, and you know what they did? They burned him at the stake, and they got rid of him quick because he was interrupting the narrative. So we've had guys on our planet try to tell us this for a long time, but not too long ago, I was having a face-to-face conversation with Paul Hellyer, who is the former Canadian Defense Minister of Canada. And he told me, yeah, there's extraterrestrials that are working with our scientists on our bases, and they are developing things. But, the people aren't, some people out there don't think that the rest of the folks out there are ready to accept that. And that's why you got guys like Spielberg who have been preparing us and have been getting us ready with the movies, right?
It's fascinating. I can't wait to see what's coming next. Now, in closing, let's talk about where you see us going, say the next 5-10 years. Do you think we're headed in the right direction as a human race? And do you think we'll ever see these free energy technologies or these consciousness technologies ever being used again?
We're in a very pivotal time right now. This is we're at a very serious crossroads or an intersection. We're going through growing pains. And now more than ever, it is a very important time that everybody looks at their thoughts, looks at their conduct, looks at how they see each other, because we're being influenced on all sides, but at the same point, we have an amazing future ahead of us. We have an incredible destiny ahead of us if we can make it to 2030. So there are lots of technologies and different developments that will be given to us. Some of those technologies will make it so that eating food is going to be optional. And so eating food will be a luxury if you want it. There is going to be means that are going to be made available to us. And there's different ways that we can do this. We can either do it naturally or technologically speaking, so that learning is going to be instantaneous, so that you will have telepathic communications, so that there is going to be a means to go wherever you like, so to speak. Life extension is most certainly going to be there. But I would say that in the next few years, some of the things we're going to have to deal with is the implementation of artificial intelligence. And where does that fit into the things? We're also going to be looking at dramatic Earth changes. And these Earth changes have more to do with our spatial coordinates, that where we are in space and what's happening inside the Earth, actually. There's a lot going on there inside the Earth with what we call the underwater mantle. And I truly believe that the greatest part about what's happening inside the Earth, around the Earth, and to us has a lot to do with consciousness. So if we can see each other in a more loving way, take responsibility for our actions, and realize that if we want to become citizens of the universe, first of all, we have to become citizens of the earth. So I really, truly believe that that's where embracing this forbidden knowledge and to really learn about who we are is really going to benefit us.
Very well said. Jonny, I want to thank you so much for coming on tonight. Your website is metaphysicalsource.com. YouTube channel is Metaphysical Source. Before you head out, tell everybody about anything interesting you got coming up.
Well, there's so many interesting things coming up always, Chris, but thank you so much for asking. It's a pleasure to be on your show always here. But most certainly, I'm very excited about an upcoming tour we have over to Egypt. It's called the Ancient Mysteries Tour, or the Ancient Stargates Tour at ancientmysterytours.com. Please join us. Because I can show you firsthand everything that we were talking about. We're going to go examine where the stargates are. We're going to talk about the things that we were saying earlier about the mufkuts, the ancient consciousness technologies, and so much more. And also, stay tuned to Chris. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Spread the word. Forbidden Knowledge News.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonny. That was amazing information, and I will definitely have to have you back on again.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. You have a great night.
Hey, you too.